All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dan's Astrology. Today is November the 16th, 2024, and very recently we just had the planet Saturn station direct in the sign of Pisces at 12 degrees. You can see here that 2 days ago, the 14th of November, it was stationing, and now it is in direct motion. And I have to admit that what is interesting to me about this primarily is not really the fact that Saturn is stationing on its own, but rather that it is now moving in direct motion towards the planet Neptune in Pisces, which leads me to think about the Neptune and Pisces conjunction that we're going to be having. However, keep in mind that because Saturn is a slow-moving planet, the Neptune and Saturn conjunction will not be perfecting until next year. So if we skip this ahead 1 year from now, you can see then we have Saturn within 4 degrees of Neptune. And then if we skip another year ahead, we can see that Saturn will be separating from the, but still very much close to Neptune, close to this conjunction. So we've had the Saturn-Neptune thing taking place over the next couple of years, but it's going to be more in effect in 2025 and 2026. So, but the thing is, this is astrology, right? What we do in astrology is that it's okay to do previews of things in the future because that's what it's for, right? But what I was thinking specifically for this video, I was doing some research about Saturn and Neptune conjunctions. I have read the Rick Tarnas book Cosmos and Psyche, and he has a chapter where he goes specifically into that. I'm not going into that now, but with that in mind, one of the things I have to say, first of all, is that Saturn and Neptune, I don't think it's necessarily the cheeriest combination. That Saturn stands for the lead element of heaviness, can be associated with things like depression, or tiredness, or old age and infirmity, or all sorts of things which aren't very pleasant. And Neptune, usually is associated with the imagination or fantasy or a certain kind of religious sentiment. And I thought, instead of me trying to just talk about the archetype of Saturn and Neptune, I would go back into history or to do some research. And I'm going to show you with my program up specific dates, and their association with Saturn Neptune. Now, the first date that I have in mind is kind of I also should say that there's a certain I'm not going to be going into the thing about communism in this one. That I am doing this is going to be pre-communist historical events, and we're not going to address the kind of the Marxist communist Soviet angle, at least not in this video. Now, the first thing that I have in mind is this historical event that happened in Spanish Florida. Back before America was all the Americans, Florida was actually, at some point in time, controlled by the Spanish. And there's an interesting date here, the year 1738. While I was researching this, here, I'll type this in. Now, keep in mind, I'm just going to go like January 1st, 1738, and not be totally on the nose exact with it. Because we're talking about the outer planets anyways, right? I'm not going that level of precision. I'm not going to bother about putting in the locations or anything. But to look at, if you type in 1738, you have Saturn and Neptune in is a pretty large orb here, I have to admit. Almost 10 degrees apart. But still, Saturn and Neptune together in Gemini. And if you also notice that the planet Uranus here is in Capricorn, which is not, is, if you were Rick Tarnas, you would count this as an opposition, because you wouldn't be so noting about the archetypal astrology thing. We'll look at this, and this is pretty much Saturn-Neptune opposite Uranus. If you want to get more precise about it, let's skip forward a year. Then you have the Saturn and Neptune conjunction moving across the sign boundary. It's very similar to what we're having with this conjunction that's going to move across Aries, right? And I think this is an interesting one to start with, because I was watching another astrologer. I won't whatever name names or whatever, but this astrologer was saying that this is a guy much more experienced than me, saying that in all his research that he's never seen anything quite like this with a Saturn, because we're going to be having Saturn and Neptune conjunct right at the 0 degree of Aries, right? Now, very similar is the 0 degree of Cancer, because the 0 degree of Aries is the spring equinox point. The 0 degrees of Cancer is the summer solstice point, right? And then also you have the Saturn and Neptune conjunct in Cancer here, making a direct opposition to the rebellious, revolutionary Uranus planet, right? And so it's also kind of funny, because I have to admit, I am a millennial-aged white guy, and I'm not really into, like, I don't know. What can I say? I'm feeling old. I don't go out and party as much anymore. And even back, let's say, if you wind the clock back 10 years ago, even at that point, I'm not feeling very like up with the music the young people listen to. But I do remember around 10 years ago, there was this song by a rap artist named Fetty who starts out with the lyrics 1738, and that's a reference to a brand of cognac, right? Now, I don't know if maybe Fetty Wap was using there could be multiple layers of interpretation here, but just having a song about drinking cognac is maybe, it's a pretty standard fare for club pop music. But I think if maybe is this a secret coded message? I don't know. But we have, anyways, in Spanish Florida, you had a place which was the first settlement of black slaves freeing slavery in the United States. It says, so I don't know, I'll read a little bit here. As early as 1689, the colonial authorities of Spanish Florida had begun to offer asylum to escaped slaves fleeing from the Virginia colony. One particular place of interest was St. Augustine, where the Spanish had established Mission Nombre de Dios with the help of Afro-Spanish slaves and settlers in the late 16th century. In 1693, King Charles II of Spain issued a royal decree proclaiming that runaways would be granted asylum in Florida in return to converting to Catholicism. Here you have that Neptune religious conversion angle, maybe, which required baptism, the Neptune baptismal thing, right? And serving for 4 years in the colonial militia. In 1742, the community had grown into a maroon settlement similar to those in other European colonies in the Americas, and the Spanish utilized the settlement as the first line of defense against outside incursions into Florida. In 1738, Governor Montiano ordered the construction of the Garcia Rio de Santa Teresa de Mose military fort about 2 miles north of St. Augustine. Any fugitive slaves discovered by the Spanish were directed to head there. If they accepted Catholicism and were baptized, those capable served in the colonial militia. The Spanish treated them as free. So I think this is a great thing if you look at the outer planets, trying to understand historical outer planet transits, and you've got a kind of a salvific Neptune and a Uranian will to freedom, basically, or Uranian will to escape and create a new free society. The first free black settlement legally sanctioned in what would become the United States, and had a population only of about 100 people. And of course, this did not last forever. Eventually, I have to say that I'm not a historian, and I'm basically just looking things up on the internet here. But eventually, obviously the Spanish control of Florida eventually ended. There was a war where the Black militia fought beside Spanish regular soldiers against British forces under James Oglethorpe, who launched an attack on St. Augustine in 1740 under the War of Jenkins' Ear. During the ensuing conflict, a Floridian force consisting of Spanish troops, Indian auxiliaries, and free black militia counterattacked Oglethorpe's troops and defeated them, destroying the fort in the process. Oglethorpe was eventually forced to withdraw his forces back to Georgia, where the black Spanish militia also participated in the unsuccessful Spanish counterattack of 1742. And by 1752, the Spanish had returned to and rebuilt Fort Mose. The new government forcibly relocated most of the free blacks back into the defensive settlement from the more cosmopolitan, multilingual culture of St. Augustine. After East Florida was ceded to the British in the 1763 Treaty of Paris, most of the free black inhabitants immigrated to Cuba with the evacuating Spanish settlers. So there you go. 1763, they gave it didn't last very long. It only lasted from 1738 to 1763, and the freed black slaves retreated to Cuba at that point. But this is one example, first of all, of Saturn-Neptune historically, with a lot of resonance to the current astrology, in the fact that you've got it on the early degrees of a cardinal sign. Now, I'm going to be jumping around here, but there's a completely different... here we have a papal bull issued by Pope Clement the 12th on April 28th of 1738. Same year, actually. 1738. We're still on 1738, the same Saturn and Neptune conjunction, banning Catholics from becoming Freemasons. It arose from Jacobite Hanoverian rivalry on the continent. Now, this whole thing, obviously, the Freemasons are still, you see the signs around in town today. There's this whole funny conversation about like the Illuminati. I actually had some relatives that I think like back in the 1950s, it was like more common for like, to join these kinds of like Masonic fraternities or, groups like that. And I don't know. I'm no expert on the subject, but there is a certain a history of obviously controversy here. Where here in this, I don't know. I'm not a historian, but the Catholics were given a strict order not to become Freemasons. So I'm assuming that maybe the Masonic societies are maybe associated more with Protestants, perhaps. But I thought this was a good one to include because you've got the same year that you had the first free black settlement in Spanish-controlled Florida, you also had maybe I'll put in the actual date here. Was it 28th of April, 1738? You had the papal bull forbidding Catholics to become Freemasons. And this, so you, under the same transit, you have, you could see Saturn as being the restrictions or the authorities and control over certain kinds of religious practices, basically, or mystical traditions or something like that. And you have that same dynamic playing out with the Catholics granting, if the free blacks chose to be baptized, they were granted free citizenship, right? Now, the same as blacks would later go on to flee to Cuba, right? I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. The other one, similarly, you have a papal bull talking about the suppression of the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits. We're skipping a bit farther ahead here. We're talking about 1773. So if I type this one in here, So if you type in 1773, you've got a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Virgo. And at this point in time, this is the conjunction that's associated. Saturn-Neptune in Virgo, again, religious prohibitions against the Jesuits. If you want more detail, historians identify multiple factors causing the suppression. The Jesuits, who were not above getting involved in politics, were distrusted for their closeness to the Pope and his power in independent nations' religious and political affairs. In France, it was a combination of many influences, from Jansenism to free thought, to the then prevailing impatience with the ancient regime, monarchies attempting to centralize and secularize political power viewed the Jesuits as a supranational, too strongly allied to the papacy, and too autonomous from the monarchs in those territory they operated. So for these reasons, the Jesuits were seen as being too powerful, too autonomous, but also too close to the church, right? They had too much of their own autonomy, but also too much influence over the structures of power. And so this, you have interesting also to notice that there's something about the power, the issue about power and corruption and stuff like that. You have a trine from Neptune in Virgo to Pluto in Capricorn at this time. You also have Jupiter in Pisces, which would be making or you've also, if you got a Uranus in Taurus as well. You've got a grand Earth trine between all the outer planets at the time that they were suppressing the Jesuits. Another one, at the same time that the Jesuits were being suppressed, there was the Boston Tea Party. Okay, so this is a classic one. You guys probably remember this from high school. That the Americans were upset at the British making a law, the Tea Act of May 10th, 1773, which allowed the East India Company to sell tea from China and American colonies without paying taxes apart from those imposed on the Townshend Acts. The Sons of Liberty strongly opposed the taxes, blah, blah, blah. So they poured a bunch of tea in protest, right? This, again, I mean, the Saturn-Neptune themes, I think, speak for themselves in that you've got water, the presence of water. You've got a protest. There could be the Uranus and Neptune combining, right? Or the trine. Like, you got this grand trine with all the outer planets. People are upset about the concentration of power and a monopoly. People are protesting, and they're doing that by making a display, an image of throwing all the tea into the harbor and ruining it. Very Saturn, right? Like, oh, too bad, your tea is ruined, and we have this image which goes down in history, right? This, which could be the Neptunian influence. Here we go. Look at that. I have to admit that when researching this, there's also a lot of problems to do with various ships sinking. So, just a general, if you're going to be planning a long sea voyage, I would try to avoid doing it while there's a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Although if you're going to plan a protest that involves throwing things into the sea, that be a way that you can use the Saturn-Neptune conjunction by throwing some stuff in the ocean. The tin can, the common tin can. I don't know why I'm including this. Well, I do, like, historically, you could see that the Frenchman Philippe de Girard had the British merchant Peter Durand patent the idea of a tin can in 1810. These things that become so ubiquitous to modern life, we consider like the tin can has just been around forever, but no. The tin can was only invented in 1810. And in 1810, you had Saturn and Neptune in Sagittarius. In a loose trine to Jupiter in Aries, and a square to Pluto in Pisces. There's a show that I watched. There's a show that I like called Hellier. and they do these like paranormal things, and for some reason, like the guy, there's this one scene where the guy is like going into some kind of like trance, and he's like, I see a tin can. And there's some reason, like there's something about that where just it seems to me that the idea of the tin can is maybe more than just a utilitarian protective device, but it holds some kind of psychic resonance that I don't know if I'm fully able to explain. But the tin can, maybe I'll just leave it at that. But there's also something about the way that Saturn is a wall, a barrier, a protective barrier, even, right? And that preserves the original integrity of the canned goods inside, so that you could have you could store food for long periods of time. And that could be a combination. That could be maybe this could be something of the positive of Saturn and Neptune together, is that it could be like a seal, right? A hermetic seal or a protective seal. You can something, you can store it. I don't know. I'm just trying to play with it right now. Okay, so but the other thing, this is a bummer. You also have the Great Famine in Ireland, the Irish potato famine. One thing that's interesting that the Irish are very associated with this historically with this famine, but potatoes themselves are not indigenous to Ireland. Potatoes are a product of colonialization, and potatoes actually came from South America, which is an interesting. I'm not gonna like get into any like deep kind of analysis of that side of it, but I do think it's kind of and I also don't want to sow fear about this upcoming conjunction, because I mean we have had some supply chain issues, but they've been mainly pretty minor, I would say. And I think there's something to be said for like being aware of history and letting that give us a sense of like how privileged we are, in that if we are going through difficult historical transits, it might get bad, but we don't have to worry about a famine, right? Like, so I'm gonna just check my notes here. It's like the timing here is 1845 to 1849. I wrote down 1846 for the conjunction, but it lasted over a period of time, so it's not just like 1 year. But I think I wrote down 1846 because you can see the closeness of Saturn and Neptune and Aquarius here. In 1845, they weren't so close. 1847, they're even closer. Apparently, I made a note here that apparently 1847 was the worst year, and it was called Black 47, right? Saturn, of course, often associated with darkness or the color black. And you've got Saturn, Neptune conjunct in a sextile to Pluto and Uranus, and in a trine to Jupiter. So yeah, I mean, I don't mean my intention here isn't to stir up doom and gloom and all this kind of stuff, but there's a potential for Saturn and Neptune to be depressing. Maybe depressing is an understatement. I have to honor the fact that this could be seen as a bad omen, in the sense that it is so strongly associated with this potato famine. Saturn, in this specific instance, you see Saturn in a Aquarius, a sign that Saturn is said to be traditionally the ruler of. So in a way, Saturn is strong Saturn itself is strong during the Irish potato famine. Like this is kind of interesting. Is a well dignified Saturn necessarily a good thing for the people? Maybe not, right? Maybe if Saturn is really strong, Saturn comes off as being more black. Just in the same way that when we had the COVID pandemic, we had Saturn going through Capricorn and Aquarius. This could be actually maybe something to be more optimistic about the Saturn in Pisces and Saturn in Aries, because when you have Saturn, Saturn's going to be going into. I mean, this is a question: what's going to happen when Saturn goes into Aries? Because Saturn is in fall in Aries. Saturn is in fall because it's the exaltation of the sun. So Aries is a place where planets that stand for light and heat and activity do well, and Saturn is kind of like instead cold and stingy and unyielding and inhospitable. It's the kind of thing that goes with a famine, and that but Aries is all about things growing, right? So there's something about that. Historically, if we look at this, Saturn in Aquarius, Saturn strong in its own sign, seems to indicate famine. What's going to happen when it's in Aries with Neptune? Maybe it won't be so bad. I don't know. I'm just looking at it anyways. The next one I have, the assassination of James A. Garfield on July 2nd, 1881. I mean, a lot of presidents have been assassinated. And I'm not really that up on my American history, but I thought this would be an interesting one to show anyways, because look at this stellium. Oh my God. Like, look at, like, as from an astrologer's perspective, like, what is going on here? You got Mars conjunct Saturn, conjunct Neptune, conjunct Jupiter, conjunct Venus, conjunct Pluto. You got a stellium of, like, what the hell is going on here? You got 6 planets all in the same sign, all in this massive lineup, and you've also got the moon in conjunct Uranus in a trine to it. So, if you want to hear about what happened, there's a guy who assassinated him. Was this guy named Charles Guiteau, if I'm pronouncing his name right. Guiteau was an American man who distributed copies of a speech he wrote aimed at promoting Garfield in the 1880 United States presidential election. Guiteau believed that his campaigning had been vital to Garfield's eventual victory, and that Garfield owed him a diplomatic post in Europe for his assistance. After months of failed attempts to solicit such a reward from the Garfield administration, he purchased a revolver and began stalking Garfield with his goal of assassinating him. After being struck by the bullets, Garfield was carried back to the White House, where he underwent medical treatment for over 2 months. So I don't know. I'm not really sure of what the significance of this is, but I thought I'd share it because, like, look at that. This is not just Saturn and Neptune. This is like a huge astrological, like, there's a load of astrological karma going into the event that was the assassination of James A. Garfield. And this could be something for further inquiry to look at, maybe how James A. Garfield's chart was getting, I guess we could, I don't know. I mean, I have not done very much preparation on this, I have to admit. James A. Garfield, maybe we'll just do this quick. So, James A. Garfield, a man who at least had the moon in Taurus. He was a Neptune and Capricorn native. He had Jupiter conjunct Uranus and Aquarius. I don't know. I'm not going to... He's a Scorpio, Taurus, full moon kind of guy. That's very similar to the full moon we just had. A good... Scorpio season, Taurus full moon dude who was assassinated when there was a massive stellium in Taurus conjunct his full moon. Great. Okay, well, I mean, that's another historical example of Saturn-Neptune, and also in this instance, a Taurus full moon. The other thing I was thinking of is Emma Goldman, the famous anarchist, who, you know, if you ever have a girlfriend who wants to tell you about the benefits of not getting married, of having relationships and not having the government in your marital life, of keeping the sanctity of the human relationship free from government meddling in a kind of anarchistic spirit, if that sentiment is familiar with you, you may be familiar with Emma Goldman. I'm sure there's lots of other reasons to be familiar with Emma Goldman, such as maybe things about birth control and World War I. There's something that happened during a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Of course, there was World War I going on. Saturn-Neptune is often associated with the use of things like mustard gas, right? Like Neptune stands for this kind of like gaseous, like a fog, or chemicals, things like that. And Saturn being like the gritty reality of trench warfare, right? I was just doing research, and apparently there's also things that happened around here where like people like Emma Goldman were organizing a new conscription league in New York where they're opposing conscription, which was like the draft. And Emma Goldman on June 15th, 1917 was arrested, and the authorities seized a wagon load of anarchist records and propaganda. They were charged with conspiracy to induce persons not to register under the newly enacted Espionage Act, and they were held on, so they're the arrest of Emma Goldman. I'm going to type that one in here. So okay, this is a bit different because you've got Saturn and Neptune out of sign, but still in a conjunction. You've also got Pluto here sharing Cancer with Saturn, although they're on other sides of it. I don't know. I don't know if there's very much to point out around this one. Uranus is here. Uranus is not really seeing Saturn and Neptune. There's not really good Saturn and Neptune Uranus contact. I don't know. This is just a random example that I'm using. But there's another thing to keep in mind of historical events. This is also, mind you, the time of the Russian Revolution. I said I wasn't going to get into communism, but if you want to, like, the exact date. Okay, I lied. I'll do it. March 1917. Again, it's kind of similar that you've got like the Saturn and Neptune conjunction out of sign here, where you have Neptune here, Saturn here, and also suspiciously Uranus, again, not really making good contact with Saturn and Neptune. Look, for Uranus being the planet that people always talk about revolution, it's suspiciously not really making very good angular contact to Saturn and Neptune here. However, the Russian Revolution lasts a chunk of time, and if you go like year by year, you can see that 1918, you've got a much stronger Saturn-Neptune conjunction here in Leo, and as you keep going, you eventually get Saturn in Leo opposite Uranus in Aquarius around 1919. So, okay, I lied. I included a bit of the communism. But there you go. These are several examples of the historical effects, historical associations of Saturn-Neptune conjunctions. Thank you for watching.